right, Stephen, you're ready. You're good to go in just 10 seconds. All right, we are live on Facebook whenever you're ready to begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Stephen Howard, the Advocacy Director with In Defense of Christians, and I am here to welcome all of you, our viewers on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, to our panel discussion for today, Christians in Turkey, the way forward for equality and religious freedom. We are gathered here today because as the voter support for the Erdogan government continues to erode in the run-up to the 2023 parliamentary and presidential elections, there are hopes that this could end Turkey's democratic backsliding and restore the rule of law and fundamental rights and freedoms. Many of the structural problems afflicting Turkey's various Christian communities, however, predate Erdogan's rise to power and cannot simply be resolved at the ballot box. Turkey requires a new policy vision to institutionalize equal citizenship, ethno-religious inclusion, and freedom of religion or belief for all. This panel will offer policy suggestions for reversing the worrying trends that have continued to bring Turkey's various Christian communities to the brink of extinction. What steps can the United States, the European Union, international organizations, and advocacy groups take to end the systemic discrimination targeting Turkey's Christian citizens and residents? We have an amazing panel of experts representing various ethnic and religious groups within Turkey. Chief amongst them, we have Dr. Ohanis Kılıçdağ, who has a double major in BA degrees in sociology and political science at Vergili University, Istanbul. And he also, from there, continued to his doctoral studies at the Department of History. And he also moved on to become a research fellow at the Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He completed his PhD in 2014, and his dissertation focused on socio-political reflections and expectations of the Ottoman Armenians after the 1908 revolution between hope and despair. Between 2003 and 2017, he lectured at Istanbul Bilgi University Sociology Department on social and political history of the late Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. From 2017 to 2019, he was a postdoc fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. He was appointed as Nikit and Eleonora Ordagian Visiting Professor at Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University this past year. He was Kazan Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies at California State University, Fresno in fall 2020. He focuses primarily on history of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, intercommunal relations in multi-ethno-religious societies, citizenship and minorities, the history of citizenship, military service, many other fields. If you're interested in following his work, he writes a column regularly in Agos, an Istanbul bilingual weekly Armenian newspaper. We also have David Vergili, who is a member of the Brussels-based European Syriac Union, who works extensively for the Chaldean Syriac and Assyrian people in the Middle East and the diaspora. For over 15 years, he's been very active in the EU and in EU institutions and has participated in events, conferences regarding these populations and communities. He's also the chief editor of the Syriac Turkish language newspaper Sabro, published monthly in Turkey, which focuses on those communities. His focus is on minorities in the Middle East and their history, as well as the current plight of the Chaldean Syriac and Assyrian people. We also have Dr. Elizabeth Prodroma with us, who teaches in the program on international negotiation and conflict resolution at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where she is faculty director of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. She is a co-president of Religions for Peace and is a non-resident senior fellow and co-chair of the Working Group on Christians and Religious Pluralism in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute's Center for Religious Freedom. She previously served as a vice chair and commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and was also a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. Her research interests focus on geopolitics and religion, democratization, religious freedom, security, and she really focuses on the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Currently, she's researching initiatives involving cultural heritage and institutional religious freedom in Turkey and Orthodox Christianity, religious diplomacy, and typologies of power. She has written many books and articles and has been published in the Journal of World Christianity, Journal of Democracy, Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Orbis. She has done a remarkable amount of work, and she regularly is a public commentator and contributor in U.S. and international media. She advises many multilateral organizations, governments, and she herself is a local activist and engaged with faith communities on these issues of inclusion, as well as human security. And she's offered testimony to groups such as the U.S. Helsinki Commission, the European Parliament, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, amongst others. We are also joined by Dr. Tuba Tanyeri Erdemir, who is a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh's Anthropology Department and the coordinator of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. She is the co-chair of the Middle East Working Group of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable. Between 2005 and 2015, she was a lecturer at the Middle East Technical University, where she was also the deputy director of the Center for Science and Society. Her focuses involve the politics of minority heritage in the Middle East, conflict and competition over sacred sites, and inclusive cultural heritage management and museum practices. She was a senior researcher in antagonistic tolerance, a comparative analysis of competing sharing of religious sites. And she also was the leader of the Turkish team in the European Commission-funded Religare Religious Diversity and Secular Models in Europe Working Group. And then finally, we have Dr. Aykan Erdemir, who is the Senior Director of the Turkey Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is a former member of the Turkish Parliament and served in the European Union Turkey Joint Parliamentary Committee. He is the rotating co-chair of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities and the steering committee member of the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief. He is a co-drafter of the Oslo Charter for Freedom of Religion or Belief and a recipient of the Stephanus Prize for Religious Freedom in 2019 and the first Freedom Award of the Hellenic American Leadership Council. He received his MA in Middle Eastern Studies and PhD in Anthropology from Harvard, and has worked as a faculty member at Bill Kent University's Department of Political Science and Public Administration and Middle East Technical University's Department of Sociology. He is the co-author of Antagonistic Tolerance, Competitive Sharing of Religious Sites and Spaces, and Erdogan's Hostage Diplomacy, Western Nationals in Turkish Prisons. So we really have an all-star panel of experts with us today. Before we begin, just so our audience is aware, the way that we are going to flow for this next hour and a half is that each of our panelists is going to offer opening statements based on questions that I have for them, and then they will then each have the opportunity to briefly respond to each other. We'll transition at that point to an audience Q&A, and then we will conclude with closing statements from our panelists. So to begin with, I actually want to turn to Dr. Ohannes Kılıçdaroğlu. And in particular, we're looking here, very recently, President Biden recognized the Armenian genocide, and there was a lot of backlash from the Turkish government for this. Now, for the Armenian community living in Turkey, how does it cope with its history in Turkey, and what positive vision does it have for a Turkey that celebrates its multi-ethnic and multi-faith history? And then furthermore, what exactly is the dynamic for this community living in a post-genocide context?
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, good. First of all, let me thank you, in Defense of Christians, for organizing this panel and giving me the chance to become a part of it. Thank you very much. And as an answer to your question, let me try to give a quick historical summary of conditions of existence for Armenians in Turkey. Okay, so I think this will be an answer to your questions. Okay, I'm gonna be as quick as possible, as fast as possible, but let me start with the aftermath of First World War. After First World War, the survivors of Armenian genocide had a hope to heal their wounds, at least as much as possible, because we know that genocides are largely irreparable events, let's say. But in that relatively more optimistic environment, they hoped perpetrators would be punished and Armenians would be given a safe home where they can live as freely as themselves. And as I said, they will try to heal their wounds in this safe home. However, after the military victories of Turkish nationalist movement in Ankara, stationed in Ankara in 1921-1922, it was understood that the Armenian community would live as a minority in a Turkish nation state. Okay, and from that point on, we know from Lerna Ekmekçioğlu's and Ari Shekeryan's work that they started to develop a survival strategy in this new expected environment, which is, as I said, a Turkish nation state. And basically, this survival strategy had 4 pillars, okay, or let's say 4 bases. The first one is complete obedience, full obedience to the political authority, meaning state, okay? And the second pillar, the second base is forgetting the past. A kind of, if you like, we can say they adopted a kind of amnesia, especially considering the memory of Armenian genocide. And the third pillar is the severance of their ties with external Armenians, or in other words, diaspora Armenians, okay? In other words, they try to distance themselves from other Armenians, from outer Armenians. I don't know, maybe we can discuss why they adopted such an attitude, maybe in Q&A, but for saving time, let me go fast again at this point. And as the fourth pillar of this survival strategy, we can say that they became invisible in public life, okay, in public sphere, as much as possible. In other words, their life were restricted between home, church, and partially school. I say partially because, of course, schools were under the control or supervised by state authorities. Basically, after that point on, they try to prove that they can be loyal Turkish citizens, okay? And until very recently, within this survival strategy, they had not mentioned the Armenian genocide, leaving its commemoration aside. Even they didn't talk about Armenian genocide within themselves, okay? They also, as I said, as a kind of, let's say, deliberate amnesia, they prefer to forget about it. Again, they aim to prove that it's possible to be loyal Turkish citizens and Christian Armenians at the same time. So they try to separate their lives into different spheres and try to prove both to the state and both to themselves that this is possible, this can be done, this is doable, being loyal citizen of Turkey and at the same time Christians, Armenian as living Christian Armenians. In Turkey, indeed, they felt at home since they had not immigrated from another part of the world to this country or to that land. Although their overwhelming majority of them left their homes in Anatolia and settled in Istanbul. This is a trend continuing also in 20th century. And today, I don't know exact numbers, but 99.9% of Armenians in Turkey are living in Istanbul. However, feeling at home, contradictorily enough, does not mean that they are peaceful or comfortable. They have faced many problems and oppression throughout the Republican history. So we can say that they lived in a familiar but hostile environment. And, you know, I say familiar because, you know, people feel familiar at their home, but again, contradictorily enough, this is also an hostile environment. As a matter of fact, their demographic melting has been continuing since the beginning of the Republic. Today, according to most optimistic estimate, there are between 50 and 60,000 Armenian citizens living in Turkey. And if you consider that their number was around 80,000 in 1927, I mean, of course, after the genocide. And also, if you consider that from that time on, I mean, from 1927 to today, the whole population of Turkey has been multiplied by almost 14 times. So in such an environment, the number of Armenians decreased by 20-25%. So, but if you consider two numbers together, then you can understand how this huge deterioration or how this melting is. And as an important footnote, let me say that when I say here Armenians and Armenian citizens, I refer to quote unquote official Armenians, because, you know, in Turkey, there are also an issue about Islamized Armenians, okay? And today, although it's not possible, even to, as an educated guess, to give their numbers, but we know that in Turkey today, descendants of those Armenians who became Muslim before, during, or after the genocide are still living in Turkey. Again, it's hard to tell their exact numbers. But here, when I say Armenians, I mean Christian, quote unquote, official and citizen Armenians. By the 2000s, as in another chapter maybe in this story, this situation started to change. Not fundamentally, but at least slightly, okay? Due to different reasons, including Turkey's quest to become an EU member, the political atmosphere in Turkey was relatively liberalized in early 2000s. And under these circumstances, Armenians in Turkey as a Christian community became more visible by both their individuals and institutions. For example, Aras Publishing House and Agos newspaper produced works about Armenian community identity and history. They started to talk more freely about sensitive topics such as the Armenian genocide. Assassination of Hrant Dink, the chief editor of Agos, in January 2007 came as a shock. But interestingly enough, it didn't completely halt the opening of the Armenian community. Agos, for example, has continued to be published until this day. Moreover, as a very important institution, Hrant Dink Foundation was added to the list of organizations that work for the rights of minorities, human rights, and preservation of multiculturalism. As for today, at the present time, backsliding of democracy and liberties in Turkey is not a secret. The country has been becoming more nationalist, chauvinist, and aggressive, as you all know. It is neither a secret that this kind of political atmosphere is much more difficult for ethno-religious minorities. And considering the recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that Turkey became a direct part of this conflict as an Azerbaijan ally, nowadays the life is not easy for Armenians in Turkey. But as a last remark and a positive remark, let me repeat that Armenian institutions and organizations continue to work. Armenian intellectuals continue to produce in Turkey. And hopefully, in a recent or near future, conditions will become more relaxed and liberalized in Turkey, and these works will be more, let's say, become more, let's say, productive. Okay, let me stop here. We can go into details of any topic in Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kılıçdaroğlu. I'd like to pivot over now to David Vergili. Mr. Vergili, today is the anniversary of Seyfo, the Ottoman Empire's genocide against the Chaldeans, Syriacs, and Assyrians. This community in Turkey continues to face adversity, ranging from the sentencing of Father Aho to the murder of Father Remzi Deril's mother and the continued disappearance of his father. These are imminent issues deserving of attention, and there are larger issues that this community continues to face. Similar to the question posed to Dr. Kılıçdaroğlu, how does this community cope with its history in Turkey, and what changes would help it continue to exist in Turkey in the future? What has the experience traditionally been like in Turkey, and what are some tangible recommendations that would improve the livelihoods of this community today?
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for In Defense of Christians for this panel about the situation of Christians in Turkey. Very important and often discussed and underrepresented issue in international media and organizations. It's as you say today, it's safe for genocide. Remember, there is since 2015 within the decision of Syriac Church and some organizations, there is a decision to remember safer genocide of 1915 of Ottoman Empire on this day, 15 June. And today, almost everywhere in the world within the Syriac Church and organizations, even in homeland, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon, and also in diaspora countries, Syriac people commemorate this genocide and holding some various activities and commemorative events. As you have mentioned in 19 genocide with the similar genocide of Armenian and Greek Pontic people, the genocide of 1915 in the Ottoman borders with different locations. I mean, Syriac, Assyrian, Chaldean people were present in a large geography with distinct and authentic religious and cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Starting the of Syriac Christianity interrupted in Mardin region, in Diyarbakir and Urfa and ancient Edessa, and on the other side of with the important Chaldean presence in the region of Syria, and also in the Iraqi Turkish border in the Hakkari mountainous area, and also stretching out also to the Urmia of Iran. There was less than 1 million of Chaldean Syriac Assyrian people living in the Ottoman borders of the time. With the genocide of 1915, according to the church documents and officials, around 500,000 people have been killed, and also important and hundreds of women and children have been forced to slavery and forced Islamization. The genocide, it's not only in terms of populations, it doesn't bring destruction only to the populations of Syriac Christians. It also at the same time brought cultural, linguistic, and monumental destruction to our people in these all mentioned lands. Today, in the region of Trabzon, before the genocide of 1915, with the presence of 2,000 Syriac Christians, there are left only 5,000 Syriac Christians in this region with distinct, places of worship and also first monasteries in the Syriac tradition and the Christianity. On that, there is also on general, there are around 25,000 Syriacs in Turkey. Majority of them living in Istanbul and in some different locations as well. We see with the following the genocide of 1915, with the foundation of a republic in Turkey, there is a continuation of policies targeting minorities and especially Christians of the country, with policies on place in terms of linguistic, economic, and political decisions. Syriac people have been again target of the denial of their rights and extermination policies, which brought them to the almost extinction. Contrary to the other minority groups like Greek and Jewish communities, Syriac people didn't have the rights according to the laws and treaty. So this brings them with another important question and dilemma in terms of constitutional guarantees and status. Nowadays, it's really a duty in Turkey to deal with these constitutional issues in terms of liberties and foundational property issues, because there is a lack of constitution regarding the situation, the status quo of Syriac Christians in the country, which bring them usually, as Dr. Aykan often mentioned in his article, which bring them and open them to the danger and put them in a situation of hostage in Turkey. This is very important issue regarding Syriac Christians in Turkey, to change this status quo for Syriac community and to grant them constitutional guarantees. On the other side, as Dr. Johannes also mentioned, there is also another issue with regard to in Turkey. They are often invisible and underrepresented and usually labeled as foreigners in their country, which they had millennial presence with their rich cultural and social heritage. This opened them to the dangers of hate speech, discrimination, and also crimes against community leaders with different times. Before, since 3 decades, with the security issues in the because Syriac people have been targeted within this conflict, and around 60 people have been murdered in this conflict, and this leads to the exodus of Syriac Christians from the country. With the last, as Dr. Johannes also mentioned, with the democratization process of the country, there was a will from Syriac people in diaspora to return to the country, but this fortunately lasted in within the Syriac community. Today, as you
I think what we might do is, David, if you can hear me, your Wi-Fi connection is not very strong right now, and so Sarah, I'm actually going to see if it's okay if we just.
Is also the case of Father Aho of
While he
runs 2 issues with other property trends for Syriac Christians.
Thank you. Apologies, David. If you can do anything to adjust your Wi-Fi connection, we'd love to hear you finish those remarks with a stronger connection. I'd like to just move on now at this point of the program to Dr. Prodroma. And my question for her is whether it be the conversion of the Hagia Sophia and the Torah and the Korah Church to historic Christian places of worship into mosques, President Erdogan's reference to the conquest of Istanbul as the most glorious chapter in Turkey's history, Turkey's violations of the cultural heritage of occupied Cyprus, and so many other issues, there seems to be a certain hostility towards the Byzantine heritage of the region, and also toward Greek Orthodox Christians who are living there today. However, Turkey's historical interference in the affairs of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, closure of the Halki Seminary, also point to larger issues that do predate the Erdogan government. So my question is, how has the Republic of Turkey viewed the Byzantine history of the region? What roles does it envision that this history play in the larger narrative of Turkey's history? And what role does it see Greeks playing in modern Turkish society? Was there any difference before the current government came to power and now? And what issues do you expect to see lingering when there is a change in government?
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to IDC for organizing this. And thank you also for the introduction that asks us to think about the questions that we're talking about with the Christians of Turkey as they relate to the upcoming 2023 parliamentary and presidential elections. Because I think what you're asking us to think about is this critical juncture in Turkish politics and geopolitics as it relates to the way forward for the Christians of Turkey. And although your question to me on the face of it may seem like an abstract theoretical question for academics dealing with history, in fact, I think you're reminding us of the importance of history in actively framing the possibilities, and by that I mean both constraints and enablers for concrete policy design and choices and decisions. And I think it's important for us to point out that until now, history and historiography have been instrumentalized and popularized in Turkey in ways that have limited the possibilities for Turkish political elites to build policies that are informed by the logics of inclusion and pluralism. And that has been nearly fatal for the survival and sustainability of the country's religious minority communities. And by that, I mean numerical minority communities. So I take very seriously that this is a moment for policymakers to escape what historians call the disease of short-termism. In other words, thinking only in terms of short-term historical episodes and not thinking about the long durée of history as it relates very actively to policymaking. So I'll start with some general comments and go to some specific comments and be mindful of time as well. In terms of general comments, I think it's important for us when we think about the Turkish state and how it's seen history and the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians of Turkey. The Turkish state in general has been no different than any other state in developing an official history that was dedicated to the project of nation building and to the ideology of nationalism. So to defining who's a legitimate citizen of Turkey, what are the criteria for legitimacy, and also to articulating then the legal, sociopolitical, and religio-cultural logics for citizenship. So in that regard, the Turkish state looks like other states. Secondly, I think it's important as a general observation to point out that Turkish state makers fully understood historiography, the writing of history, as an explicitly political project that had to address the reality of the country's Christian populations, and most specifically that had to address the country's Greek Orthodox Christians and ecumenical patriarchate. That was the largest remaining Christian community after the Ottoman genocide against Christians and after the population exchange organized under the Treaty of Lausanne. And that was also the community that was understood by the Turkish state as the inheritors of, or the remnants of, the Byzantine Empire, on whose foundations the Ottoman Empire had been built. And finally, by virtue of its organic connections to Hellenism, to Greek thought and language, the ecumenical patriarchate was associated by Turkish state makers with the wars of nationalism that led to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So the politics of writing history for the new Turkish state under Kemalist leadership, but that's continued up to the present in the Erdoganist period, has been very consistent in viewing the ecumenical patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community as both a domestic political problem and a foreign policy geopolitical problem that has to be interpreted, managed, and instrumentalized. And from a maximalist perspective, either absorbed and appropriated or disappeared and erased. So in shorthand terms, this has meant that two things. The conquest motif has been dominant in two ways. First of all, number one, the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians are seen as remnants of the Byzantine Empire that was conquered by the Ottomans. And so the conquest trope, we've seen its ubiquitousness in the last year with the reversion of Hagia Sophia to active mosque status, but it's everywhere around in Istanbul as well, with the term Fatih being associated with structures, sites, and areas of Istanbul that were explicitly related to the Byzantines' religious and cultural institutional structures. And then secondly, that conquest motif has implied both inferiority and suspicion when it comes to the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians. After all, the community is inferior because it was conquered. It was conquered because of the superiority of Islam and ethnic Turkish identity, and it was suspicious by virtue of being non-Sunni Muslim, non-ethnically Turkish, and most especially by virtue of its shared religion and ethnicity with the neighboring Greek state. So this is the kind of general historiographical framework in which the experience of the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians has played itself out in Turkey. Moving on just to see how consequential that historical interpretation and instrumentalization has been, I'll give three very brief examples. Continuing on with the writing of history, one, religious freedom policy, number two, and cultural heritage policy, number three, all of which take us back to where we started, the impacts on building a democratic Turkey or moving away from democracy towards an authoritarian Turkey. So in terms of each of these more specific examples, in terms of historiography, and you can see how powerfully this trope of conquest with suspicion and inferiority plays itself out. In terms of historiography, Kemal and the Turkey's early state makers, they built actually purposefully a cross-disciplinary cadre of state-supported professional intellectuals who were dedicated to a new national identity project. It's called the Turkish Historical Thesis. And it was developed in the Turkish Review of Anthropology. And I think it's useful to go back and read some of that journal. It was an academic journal published from 1925 to 1939 by the University of Istanbul's Faculty of Medicine and Anthropology Institute. And the raison d'etre of the institute was to promote this new Turkish historical thesis that combined eugenics, that drew on eugenics to posit the superiority of what was called the Turkish race. And here, a quote I think is very instructive. In the 1930s, the then Minister of Justice in Turkey referred to, I'll read the quote, it was published in the journal. He referred to Greeks, Jews, and Armenians who, while living there for a long time, were the descendants of a mongrel race who were not genuine Turks and could only have one right in the Turkish fatherland, that is, to be a servant and a slave. Now, I think the quote is instructive, not because of what it communicates and the terms that it uses, but most importantly for our purposes of democratization and inclusion, it highlights the second classness of Greeks, Jews, and Armenians in this case. It highlights that they have been conquered and that they are inferior. And so that kind of historiographical project has been disseminated and internalized in civil society in ways that are actively and passively displayed towards those communities. So that's one example. And I cite that because, again, we tend to think that there's no connection between history and policy, and yet there are very active and deliberate connections in Turkey as well as around the world. The second example, specific example, would be, and please flag me when I get to 3 minutes if I'm not already there, because I want to be respectful of time. The second example would be in terms of religious freedom policy. So we know that the right of religious institutions and communities to self-govern means no coercive interference in the internal functioning of those communities. But we know that where the ecumenical patriarchate is concerned, property confiscations, and certainly the now just completed 50-year closure of the Greek Orthodox Theological School of Halki has been at odds with that kind of internal governance, free governance. And then finally, in terms of cultural heritage policy, which I know we'll hear a lot about now, the renaming of so many patriarchal sites in Istanbul, churches, associated hospices and hospitals, under the rubric of Fatih conquest, I think is instructive. And most recently, the semiotics of the new mosque in Taksim, whose size and location obscure the sightlines of the large patriarchal Ayet Triada church in the area, with prayers on May 28th, the day before May 29th, the fall of Constantinople, conquest, reinforce that motif in semiotics. And I think I probably have only 30 seconds left. What to do and why does this matter? I think all of these points are critical for Turkey's Democrats, activists in the political class and in civil society who are committed to moving beyond this kind of hackneyed dichotomy of Kemalist secular democracy and Erdogan as Islamist authoritarianism, because where the country's Greek Orthodox community are concerned, but the other religious minorities are concerned, there's been a continuity there. So easy things to do: change the discourse, renegotiate, for example, the Cultural Heritage MOU that was signed by the US and Turkey on January 19th, 2021, in a way that redefines historical and geographical parameters of membership in the country's rich pluralist national identity. Two, reopen the Halki Theological School as an independent school under the independent governance of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and don't use citizenship or visa requirements as coercive tools. And three, look at cultural heritage management as part of human rights and religious freedom policy in order to address ways that sites can be points of sharing and points of respect rather than points of instrumentalization and weaponization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prodroma. And that really transitions us nicely to our next panelist, Dr. Tuba Chinyeri Erdemir. And my question for Dr. Erdemir is, what is the role of cultural heritage in efforts of building an inclusive and pluralistic society? Why is historic preservation so important in preserving Christianity in Turkey? And what are the benefits and caveats of heritage management strategies for sacred sites?
In many ways, my presentation follows Dr. Prodroma's very nicely. And I would like to elaborate on some of the points that she pointed out so articulately. We normally think of heritage, historic monuments, as things of the past. But let me start by reminding that religious heritage sites are critical for the future. And they are important for the sustainability and survival of faith communities. They are visible, palpable testimony of the presence of these ancient communities, and not only a source of pride for their descendants in Turkey and beyond, but also can be nodes for building an inclusive and pluralistic future. This being said, Turkey presents a very complex case in terms of religious cultural heritage management and protection. On the one hand, the Turkish government invests significant resources for restoring religious minority heritage sites, including iconic sites such as the historic Greek Orthodox monastery of Sümela in Trabzon, and the Armenian Apostolic Church of Akdamar in Van. On the other hand, the Turkish government's increasingly exclusivist and discriminatory religious cultural heritage policies, such as the conversion of Hagia Sophia last year and the expected conversion of Kora into mosques, reinforced hierarchies among citizens of different faiths, abolishing even the semblance of equal citizenship by relegating religious minorities to, as inferior subjects. Let me start by comparing two projects from the last decade involving the restoration of two iconic Armenian churches in Turkey, which offer crucial insights as to the benefits and pitfalls of such initiatives. Akdamar and Surp Giragos Armenian Apostolic Churches in Turkey's Kurdish majority provinces of Van and Diyarbakir respectively went through extensive restoration projects, though different processes and with different outcomes. While the Turkish government undertook Akdamar's restoration through its Ministry of Culture, the Istanbul-based Armenian Surp Giragos Foundation spearheaded the latter in cooperation with the pro-Kurdish municipal authorities in Diyarbakir. Following restoration projects, Akdamar became a museum under state jurisdiction, open for worship only one day a year, whereas Surp Giragos was consecrated as a church, which was a decision of the Armenian community itself. For the Turkish government, Akdamar served as a spectacle of tolerance, showcasing Ankara's efforts to convince a predominantly Western audience that it respected minority rights. Ironically, the attempt to demonstrate inclusion played out through an exclusionary process. The Armenian community's participation in the decision-making processes was limited. The site functioned as a state-run museum that required the purchase of a ticket to visit, except for the annual liturgy hosted by the Turkish government with the participation of invited Armenian clergy from Istanbul. Although the site attracted thousands of Armenians from Turkey and elsewhere, they were the guests and never the hosts. By contrast, the Armenian community were the hosts and not the guests at Surp Giragos. Supported by the pro-Kurdish local authorities of the Sur municipality in Diyarbakir, Sur municipality and Diyarbakir Metropolitan Municipality, the Armenian foundation that owned the site was the main decision maker. While Akdamar served as a government spectacle for one day of the year, Surp Giragos became a safe haven for past traumas to be acknowledged by the descendants of both the victims and perpetrators of genocide. A diverse crowd attended the inauguration in 2011, during which Diyarbakir's then Metropolitan Mayor, Osman Baydemir, welcomed them by saying, I quote, "You are not our guests, we are our guests," end of quote. Abdullah Demirbaş, the mayor of the historical Sur district, followed him by saying, I quote, "Our grandparents, incited by others, committed wrongs, but we, their grandchildren, will not repeat them," end of quote. Let me now turn to the case of Hagia Sophia, which made headlines around the world following Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's conversion in 2020. This famed 6th century Byzantine imperial church was converted into a mosque following Istanbul's conquest in 1453, and then served as a museum since 1934. In his July 10th speech announcing to open Sophia, Erdogan highlighted how Hagia Sophia's conversion would gratify, I quote, "the spirit of conquest," end of quote, of Mehmet II. On July 24th, Ali Erbash, the head of Turkey's Directorate of Religious Affairs, gave the first Friday sermon at Hagia Sophia with a sword at hand, symbolizing a tradition of conquest. Such rhetoric and posturing risk branding Turkey's non-Muslim citizens as reconquered subjects and thereby as second-class citizens. The conquest mentality that has shaped Turkish government's Hagia Sophia policy and the rhetoric not only puts the sacred heritage of Turkey's religious minorities at risk, but also threatens their lives, making them potential targets of hate crimes. This climate of fear causes irreparable damage to interfaith coexistence and pluralism in Turkey. Although Hagia Sophia and Hora are currently at the center of interfaith tensions in Turkey, such religious cultural heritage sites also have a great potential to serve as symbols of multi-faith coexistence, diversity, and pluralism. In their former status as museums, they not only received proper maintenance and professional care, but also contributed to building inclusive societies by highlighting the legal equality of stakeholders from different backgrounds. The showcasing of Christian heritage sites by lavish restoration projects such as Sümela and Akdamar, carried out by the Turkish state without proper consultation with the relevant religious minority communities, cannot remedy the long list of injuries resulting from conversions of Christian heritage sites into mosques. Turkish President Erdogan, for example, chose to reopen Sümela Monastery, a Greek Orthodox rock art monastic complex located in Trabzon, on July 28, 2020, only days after the first Islamic prayers in Hagia Sophia. The reopening of Sümela Monastery aimed at deflecting criticism Turkey received all around the world after the conversion of Hagia Sophia. Erdogan's invitation of the Greek Orthodox community to hold liturgy at Sümela Monastery on August 15th was not only patronizing, but also reckless during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. A justification the ecumenical patriarch noted for his inability to partake in the ceremonies. The Turkish government needs to realize that showcasing of religious minorities in state-orchestrated spectacles of tolerance and inclusion not only fails to remedy the long list of injuries to freedom of religion or belief in the country, but also puts further political pressure on them. Now, these cases show that Turkey has a problematic track record in dealing with religious cultural heritage, even when the government attempts to stage spectacles of tolerance and inclusion. Ankara's policies end up reinforcing sectarian hierarchies and institutionalizing discrimination. This being the case, however, as with the example of Sırp Giragos, heritage sites have the potential to serve as sanctuaries outside the narrow confines of everyday politics, where reconciliation and amends making can take place, fostering an inclusive and pluralistic ethos. Supporting cultural heritage projects that involve the preservation and restoration of minority heritage sites provides an opportunity to engage with multiple stakeholders, ranging from communities at risk and other locals to municipal authorities and state functionaries in Ankara, and is equally important as criticizing that don't. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Erdemir. And now we are going to transition to Dr. Aykan Erdemir now for just taking a couple steps back here, looking at the big picture. Christians are only 0.2% of Turkey's population today. Why does the state see them as a threat and interfere in their religious leadership and cultural heritage? What drives the spike in this scapegoating and intimidation of Christians? In the post-Erdogan era, what policies should future Turkish governments devise and implement to end the systemic discrimination the country's Christian citizens and residents have been facing, and institutionalize freedom of religion and belief for all?
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, IDC, for hosting this panel, and particularly for hosting a forward-looking panel, because we do have quite a number of important events on the ongoing discrimination, intimidation, and scapegoating. But I think we really need to start thinking about what is the next step, meaning how can Turkey move beyond its current exclusionary regime to an inclusionary system, a governance model, especially now that most polls predict a defeat for Erdogan in the upcoming 2023 elections. Now, I think the first step for both Turkish citizens and Turkey watchers is a recognition that this kind of discrimination, intimidation, scapegoating continued from the Ottoman era to the Republican era, and will likely continue after Erdogan. There seems to be a no quick fix in the horizon. Yes, for many of Turkey's quote unquote unmarked citizens, meaning, ethnically Turkish, religiously Sunni and Hanafi citizens, maybe the end of the Erdogan era might have a liberating potential. But for Turkey's marked citizens, especially Christians, Jews, Alevis, and atheists, as well as residents, not just citizens, but also residents, many of the structural problems are there to stay. And unless there is an immediate step taken today to admit and recognize some of these long-running problems, also by members of the opposition. So maybe one of the key take-home messages from today could be, for a member of Turkey's opposition, simply being the fact that they oppose Erdogan does not suffice to make them credible agents of change, credible agents to restore or build inclusion and diversity. And possibly one of the crucial steps to take is to admit and recognize the latent supremacism that has taken hold of Turkey throughout the Republican era. Yes, Turkey has a major divide between self-identified Islamists and self-identified seculars, and they do have different outlooks in life, but ultimately they seem to be almost on the same page when it comes to Turkey's religious minorities, in the sense that they both tend to see them as potential fifth columns, as potential security threats. Yes, for Islamists, this rests on a civilizational, either a pan-Islamist or neo-Ottoman worldview, as Christians and Jews being the other. But for many seculars who would claim to be inclusive, they also have a tendency to securitize the minority issue and see Turkey's Christians particularly as potential collaborators of external forces wanting to, divide or destabilize Turkey. And for those of you who follow the Turkish media closely, this is really ubiquitous, meaning even some of the most quote unquote enlightened members of the Turkish opposition could have these slips of the tongue in which they in a way manifest that they have some hidden prejudice that really characterize their outlook on political issues, especially when it comes to minority issues. So as a former lawmaker, let me go quickly into some of the key policy steps that need to be taken, and not in a decade, but immediately, meaning the day after there is a new government in Turkey. So if Turkey's big tent umbrella, coalition succeeds in winning parliamentary and presidential elections, they should really commit to starting reform from day one. And I would argue that at the top of the to-do list would be granting or recognition of the legal status of Turkey's religious communities, especially minority religious communities, because the lack of a legal persona or the refusal to recognize their corporate identity, their corporate entity status, is at the root of many of the problems, because a legal status is the prerequisite for full property rights, for enjoying full property rights. It's an obstacle to self-governance, and coupled with the Turkish government's ongoing obstacles for religious minority foundations to elect board members, this is basically an attempt to decapitate these communities, because the more the state meddles in the election of both faith and lay leaders of Christian communities, the more these communities are at risk of extinction. because there appears to be then a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, you see these spectacles of inclusion and tolerance, which do not amount to real inclusion, real embrace of diversity. But on the other hand, you're basically driving out Christians, decimating communities. And if this trajectory continues, Turkey will end up with museumified or like showcased Christian, churches and religious sites, but no Christians, but only tourists to visit them. And then a key issue is also to tackle the question of training of faith leaders. The Halki Seminary remains shuttered, and there are all sorts of institutional obstacles to training of faith leaders, to carrying out religious education, and also disseminating one's faith. Turkey's Directorate of Religious Affairs, namely the Diyanet, is actively proselytizing a Sunni Hanafi version of Islam 24/7, but proselytization by Christians themselves is not only criminalized, but also treated completely differently by all levels of Turkey's state apparatus. So the state should begin to be at equal distance to all faiths and to all manifestations of faith. And this is a more proactive agenda as to rebuild an inclusive and enabling and accommodating governance structure. But at the same time, we know that there is an urgent need for restorative justice as well. The question is not just about building an inclusive system, but the question is also about undoing some of the past wrongs. Of course, the first step, which is, I would argue, the easiest step that could be taken the day after, is an official apology and recognition of the past wrongs, then coupled in time with restitution of property, proper compensation, as well as a state commitment to diversity training at all levels, and a commitment to ending Turkey's culture of impunity. And what better way to demonstrate that than by bringing some of these most heinous hate crimes to justice? We know that most hate crimes, violent hate crimes targeting Turkey's Christian as well as Jewish communities remain unpunished. Court cases drag on for years and years, and often culprits or suspects are treated leniently. And this is, of course, in stark contrast to journalists, academics, philanthropists who dedicate their lives to diversity and inclusion. Here we have to remember the ongoing persecution of Osman Kavala, who is one of Turkey's top philanthropists who have dedicated his life to embracing and promoting diversity in Turkey. So I call him a secular saint, and he is really a crucial force in Turkey to push for some of the changes I have been outlining. And it's really shameful that he has been jailed in a maximum security prison in solitary confinement by the Erdogan regime. So let me end now, because my time has come to an end, by also suggesting that one easy formula for Ankara to take is to commit to implementing all the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights without further delay, and also to commit to the full implementation of the European Convention on Human Rights as an overall formula for bringing these steps into action. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Erdemir. At this point in the program, what we're going to do is give each of our panelists 60 seconds each just to respond to the comments that were just made by all of them collectively. I want to encourage people who are in the Zoom call, people who are online on Facebook or Twitter, this is the time right now where you want to send your questions in. So look at the chat box, look at the comment box. We are monitoring it. But at this point in time, I wanted to pivot over to David Vergili. I know there were some Wi-Fi issues earlier, and I wanted to see if you'd be kind enough just to finish your remarks and offer any other thoughts for us at this time.
So thank you, Stephen. Indeed, I will have some additional. I agree on the cultural preservation points of the speeches. I would like to a decision of Father Aho in Mardin. There were some visits from US officials in Ankara and also from European Union delegation to the monasteries of Mardin, to Mor Gabriel Monastery and to the Deir el-Zafran Monastery, US, and they had visited the bishops of the monastery.
I apologize, Mr. Vergili. The Wi-Fi is not very strong today. I might suggest switching to your hotspot. Hopefully,
discuss latest situation regarding Father Aho and in general situation of Syrian community in Turkey.
I think Sarah, if you'd be kind enough just to mute David again, and maybe if we could message him and encourage him.
I have messaged him. Yeah, I have messaged him. I don't think he's receiving the messages.
Okay, well, hopefully he'll be able to contribute later. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I want to pivot over to Dr. Kılıçdaroğlu at this point in time, just for any initial reactions to the statements that were made on the panel.
There are many things that we can say, but let me underline an important point that you mentioned, Stephen. You said that today the percentage of Christians or non-Muslims in Turkey is 0.2%. And it doesn't make sense to perceive such a tiny community as a threat to the whole country. I agree. This is, this is not a rational approach or thinking. But let me remind that in 1930s, if I remember right, the whole percentage of Jews in Germany is 1%. So this kind of ideologies, as we all know, do not require reason, okay? So they feel this kind of feelings in community, in the larger community, in Turkish society, in our case. So I agree with all policies that Professor Aykan Erdemir mentioned. Maybe as an addition and related to this kind of ideology and culture, I think it's also important to articulate, if you like, anti-racist discourse or anti-discriminatory discourse in every sphere of life, including politics itself, including, of course, education, systematic national education, including social media. I think this kind of, as I say, anti-racist, anti-discriminatory discourse is important to counter all these irrational approach to minorities or Christians in Turkey in this case, I think. Just I want to mention this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kılıçdaroğlu. Excellent thoughts. Dr. Prodroma, any quick initial reactions from our opening statements from our panelists?
Sure, just quickly, I think this whole issue of, the historical conjuncture, the moment at which we find ourselves and approaching 2023 elections is important. I think it's hard to imagine a scenario where in 2023 and 2024 that President Erdogan departs the scene through legal mechanisms. These are big anniversary years for him and for everything he's been trying to accomplish in Turkey. So I think, it's a period of great caution when it comes to the safety, the physical safety of these vulnerable communities in Turkey. And I think it's important to recognize that and try to find ways to ensure their protection, because they're easily scapegoated, as they were after the failed coup attempt of 2016. They were scapegoated and highlighted and targeted for episodic violence. So that's just a general statement. And the other thing too is this important recognition of the distinction between active violence versus systemic discrimination. And I think all of us have highlighted the fact that active violence against these communities, although the Greek Orthodox community has experienced regular episodes in the previous century, I think active violence in terms of large episodes is largely missing. But we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking the absence of that means full citizenship and rule of law and security. So looking at these pernicious legal mechanisms that have created systemic and comprehensive discrimination, I think is also important. And then just finally, in terms of, ICON's really great sort of list of the day after mechanisms, I think those are extremely useful. And I also would add to those the recognition of the Diyanet, which has grown in some ways to be, a state within a state, and the use of the Diyanet, which has a $2 billion budget in 2020, 4 times the budget of the Vatican, for example, both as a domestic tool of the kinds of discriminatory policies we've talked about, but as a foreign policy tool as well, that in places like occupied Syria in the north, occupied Cyprus almost 50 years, activities in Libya, East Africa, we could go on, is being used to, with the same discriminatory focus against groups who are seen as either hostile to the Turkish state, Turks who are hostile to the Turkish state, ethnic Turks and Sunni Muslims, or members of these minority communities.
Also, just for our viewers who don't know, could you kindly just define the Diyanet as an institution?
Sure. So the Diyanet Directorate General, or the Ministry of Religious Affairs, which is tasked with managing the all of the religious affairs of the Hanafi Sunni majority community in Turkey.
Thank you very much. I want to pivot over now to Dr. Taneri Erdemir for any initial impressions so far.
I'd like to thank our fellow panelists. First of all, I think the presentations really fit each other very well. I was thinking about Ohannes's initial introduction about how the Armenian community became invisible as a self-protection way. And building on Elizabeth and David's presentations that highlighted how the Christian communities in Turkey were diminishing over time and how rapidly that happened. I was thinking about, again, cultural heritage contributes to adding to the visibility of those communities in Turkey, and as such, it's important for making those communities visible. And thinking about ICON's comment about restorative justice, and restorative justice at one point should include restitution of property as well. And I know both the Greek Orthodox community spent a lot of effort in regaining control of Halki Seminary, and the Syriac community, maybe David could fill us up on that a little bit, is spearheading efforts in reclaiming some of the monasteries and lands taken away from the Syriac community.
Thank you. Absolutely, Dr. Taneri Erdemir. And I want to pivot over to Dr. Icon Erdemir now for any initial thoughts.
So now I've unmuted myself. A quick comment, given the wealth of information provided by this really wonderful lineup of panelists, I think, and since we have not only policy people, but also a lot of advocacy people in the audience now, I think one task we can leave this panel with is to reach out not only to the Turkish government, but also Turkish opposition figures as well as advocacy groups in Turkey to share some of these concerns. And the reason I'm making this call is that as a former lawmaker, I know the kind of tunnel vision policymakers and Turkey-based kind of representatives find themselves in, especially in the run-up to a very fierce, electoral battle. And unless advocacy communities, unless policy analysts and academics reach out and kind of draw their attention to what might appear to them a marginal issue, because they might say, oh, this is only about 0.2% of the Turkish public, but what in effect is central to Turkey's democratic governance and pluralism deficits. So again, I would like to end by saying we should really raise these issues with multiple Turkish stakeholders so that this issue is not marginalized and becomes mainstream, becomes centerpiece to building a pluralist and inclusive democracy in Turkey in the aftermath of 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Erdemir. I wanted just to ask real quick for both of you, yourself and for your better half, the conversion of the Hagia Sophia to a mosque, is that on day one of a new government something that could be reversed, or is this a fundamental paradigm shift that will be very difficult to undo?
My opinion on the subject is that it is very hard to undo. If the status of Hagia Sophia is going to be changed, it requires a lot more discussion and negotiation, including all the parties and experts in whatever the next stage in this amazing monument's history will be. So I think I don't think it's an easily reversible decision, and I would not necessarily advise it.
So my quick take is that when it comes to freedom of religion or belief and minority rights, repairing damage is much more difficult than the actual damage itself. So this is going to be an important legacy of the Erdogan era, meaning even when Erdogan is gone, and even possibly when the AKP is gone as a political party, for decades, some of the hate and prejudice and sectarianism inculcated in the Turkish public and built into some of these institutional processes will remain with us. And it will take a greater effort and resourcefulness and moral courage to undo some of that damage. Because when you think about it, majoritarian discrimination is always easier to put into effect, but an inclusive governance model that highlights the rights and freedoms of minorities is always a greater challenge, given you have to build majorities, moral majorities behind such calls. So that I think is going to be a challenge. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but it simply is that we have to recognize the challenges before we can really have confidence that we can undo some of that damage.
I wanted to pivot to Dr. Prodroma right now as well. This is obviously frustrating to hear, especially for Christians, I'm sure for many Orthodox Christians. My question is, what is a reasonable standard that you think we actually should hold a future Turkish state to?
I think a reasonable standard is to hold the Turkish state to its commitments under international law. And I think where the Hagia Sophia is concerned in particular, since it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, we all know that Turkey violated its responsibilities under the UNESCO Convention in terms of the action that it took with the Hagia Sophia. Having said that, I do agree with Tuba that the likelihood of a reversal is very slim, but there are all sorts of things in between, options in between, either reversal to museum or continuation simply as a mosque. And if indeed we talk about shared heritage and shared heritage sites, one of those policy options could be for the Hagia Sophia to be used on Sundays as the seat of the ecumenical patriarchate, as it's used on Fridays for for Islamic prayer. So that would acknowledge certainly the purposes, to paraphrase the Erdogan government, the purposes for which the site was originally intended, and it would also satisfy the multi-faith use and attachments to the site. So there are a lot of solutions between these two extremes, and I think it's important of reversal or simply continuing the way things are. And I think the kinds of innovative and creative policy thinkers on the screen here, I'll accept myself from that, but I think can contribute to that. The other thing too, I think that's very, very important is, again, going back to the point about continuities. If we, again, imagine a scenario, Aykan mentioned a post, Erdogan, post even AKP Turkey, a return to the status quo before 2002 isn't a solution for the survival of these endangered minorities. I mean, and in the case of, the Greek Orthodox community, we're talking about a community less than 2,000 people now. But all of these communities are at risk. And I think it's important to, when we reach out, and I think you are absolutely right, I come to engage, encourage, collaborate, cooperate with, those who are in the political class concerned with democracy and a reversal of authoritarianism, not to suggest that the previous discourse of Kemalist secularist democracy in any way approximated the realities on the ground, certainly for religious and ethnic minority communities. But I think we've seen the fragility of those rights of speech, conscience, assembly, property, education, all of those that now many Turkish citizens do not enjoy. So a reversion to status quo ante is not a solution. It's just simply a slowing down of the current process. And the current process is an acceleration of policies and legal mechanisms and tools that were established by self-defined, secularists. And so I think this language of inclusion and, democratic robustness is one that needs to be foregrounded overall, and looking at rupturing the continuities and finding new policy tools that can privilege inclusion and rule of law is the only way forward to allow those communities to survive, and to certainly to give leverage to democratizers inside Turkey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prodroma. I'd like to pivot over to Dr. Kılıçdaroğlu now, and there's a question I have, and there's a couple of questions in the chat box for you. My question is, how exactly, what is the roadmap for the Turkish government to actually recognize the Armenian genocide? That's one question. Number two, for the Armenian community in Istanbul, this is a question from John in the chat. What was the reaction to the U.S. recognition? Is the community concerned that this could help or hurt them in Turkey and in Turkish society? And then another question from an anonymous attendee. The question is, what exactly, where do the Hemshin people fit into this equation? Again, I think if you mentioned this, I believe earlier, but if you just want to even redefine who they are, how they fit into Armenian identity in Turkey today. So 3 questions for you there.
Okay, let me start from the last one in terms of Hamshin people, because I said that, I make the distinction between official and unofficial, quote unquote, Armenians. And our participant asked that where do Hamshin people position in this map? For state, for public authority, of course, Hamshin people are not defined or recognized as Armenians. So in that sense, they are not official. But turning to our Hamshin people themselves, we see a fragmented approach or fragmented thinking among these people. A part of them, as far as I know, deny their possible Armenian roots or Armenian identities, whereas another part, I cannot say that which one is majority within this Hamshin people, but another part of Hamshin people are more ready to accept their ties with a sort of Armenians, etc. So this is the quick answer of this question. For state, of course, they are not Armenians. For Hamshin people themselves, there is a fragmented. For Armenians, for official Armenians, they are also ready to accept these Hamshin people as Armenians or historical Armenians in the region. So this is a complicated situation and differing depending on from which perspective, from which actor's perspective you look. Coming to Biden's recognition and its effect on Armenian community, I may answer this question at two levels. The first level is the official institutions which are representatives of Armenian community. But again, let me add that this quality of being representative is not legal, as Professor Aykan Erdemir mentioned, but a de facto situation. But this is another complicated issue. And of course, Armenian Patriarchate is the first and foremost representative institution in this sense of Armenian community. And whenever Armenian genocide comes to the agenda in international platform, in another country, etc., we hear some what I would call as semi-compulsory statements from Armenian Patriarchate. And this time it was not different when Biden made that last statement. And in those remarks from Patriarchate, we see that they try again, as I said in my initial remarks, they try to prove their loyalty to Turkish state. So in this case also, after Biden's recognition, Armenian Patriarchate made such a declaration, again, more or less, which tried to show that Armenians are standing with their, quote unquote, their state, I mean, Turkish state. The second level is ordinary people, I mean, ordinary Armenians, if you like. Of course, this will be a generalization, what I say, but I can say that on that part, there is an ambivalent situation, because on the one hand, of course, Biden's recognition is a psychological relief for Armenians in Turkey, as it is for other Armenians anywhere in the world, okay? So, but on the other hand, they also worry that this recognition may bring about some reprisals from Turkish state or from Turkish society, okay? So in this sense, on the one hand, they are happy, if you like, that Biden recognized this genocide or accept or use this term in his statements. But on the other hand, of course, they also worrisome about the possible results of this recognition on Armenians in Turkey. And as for your question, I don't expect a soon recognition of Armenian genocide by Turkey or Turkish state and by official circles. But what I think what is more important is to have an environment, and relaxed, liberal environment in which Armenian genocide can be discussed, at least. Because, you know, compared to 1980s, 1990s, as I said, 2000s, even 2010s are better in this sense. So Armenians or non-Armenians have been more free to talk about Armenian genocide. So rather than a formal recognition, I think it is important to maintain this environment as much as we can in Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kılıçdaroğlu. I wanted to move now to Mr. Vergili for the final question of our Q&A. And Mr. Vergili, the question in particular is, how has the Turkish government used the longstanding Turkish-Kurdish conflict to target Christians? If you could kindly unmute yourself.
So I don't know whether you hear me or not now.
You're good. Please proceed.
Yeah, do you hear me now?
Mr. Vergili, yes, please go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, regarding this conflict between Kurdish forces and Turkish government, we can see, as I mentioned in my speech, during the 19th, within this conflict, there had been around 60 Syriac people killed in the Turabin region, and some villages also emptied during this conflict. And this affects greatly Syriac people in Turabin, and this caused also last migration of our people from the region. As for today, we can see this situation also in Syria, and especially in northern Syria, with the invasion of Turkey to the northern part of Syria. There is also danger on Syriac communities and in general minorities and other Christian communities in Syria. During the conflict in Syria, we saw some steps taken by the Turkish government, especially in Mardin and in Deir al-Zafaran, holding prayers in Deir al-Zafaran monastery, and presenting these that minority groups or Christian minority groups in Turkey standing with the Turkish army in the northern Syria operation, which was actually organized and planned whole the program of the prayer by the Turkish government. As Dr. Aykan usually mentioned this issue in his articles, we see clearly a hostage policy regarding minorities in Turkey, instrumentalize their presence with the internal conflicts and also with the wider international events such as Armenian genocide and conflict in Syria, and also relations regarding European Union. There is really a stand of Turkish government regarding minorities to use them with this kind of international crisis and put them on the front in order to create a new picture for the Turkey and the Turkish government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vergili. I want to move now to just to our closing statements for our panelists. I know we're running just a little bit over in terms of time, but just to conclude things, I want to hear from each of you one last time. So first, I'd like to turn to Dr. Kılıçdaroğlu.
I mean, let me again thank you for organizing this panel as a last remark. And again, as Professor Aykan Erdemir said, we should be aware of that the approach to Christians, or non-Muslims, let's say, as a minority group, is not restricted with this existing government, with AKP government. It is more entrenched, if you like, into the Turkish culture. So I think we need, besides short-term policies, we also need more long-term approaches to offset, or if you like, to correct this cultural or ideological approach to Christians and other minorities in Turkey. But again, at institutional level, as the recognition of legal persona of patriarchates, Armenian and Greek patriarchates, and opening of educational institutions for clergy would be some relatively easier steps as they are dependent on a political will. They are a matter of political will, and hopefully, I mean, I said hopefully, but I cannot nurture many hopes here. But hopefully, these institutional solutions will be realized soon, let's say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kılıçdaroğlu. I want to turn now to Mr. Vergili.
So thank you so much again for this panel. And as a last point, I agree with all points of the panelists regarding hate speech, racism, and democratic backlash in their country. But the last point also mentioned that active participation of Christian communities or as a minority groups to the political process of the country, it's really vital for our communities. And we clearly see this in the Turkish parliament nowadays with the presence of Armenian and Syriac members of the parliament, which can create difference and bring hot issues of these communities to the attention of the public opinion. And as we spoke to the coming elections, it's also important to put our hate on these elections and be active in this process and in the political process for the future and for the survival of Christian communities in the country. So thank you so much for this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vergili. I'd like to now turn to Dr. Prodroma.
Echoing everyone else,
You're good, Dr. Prodroma.
Echoing everyone else, I want to thank the organizers for this panel and being forward-looking. I think I would like to emphasize that the importance of history, active importance of history, and the way in which we have seen steps inside Turkey to use history in a way that is incompatible with the survival of these minority communities. So that leads to 23 and 24. And, you know, thinking about what might happen to them, they're particularly vulnerable. So thinking about protections and then thinking about low-hanging fruit. And I do think reopening Halki and other educational institutions, that is low-hanging fruit. It's high return, low risk, both for those in Turkey who care about democracy and inclusion and for the survival of those communities. And I think that's where at the foreign policy level too, if we're thinking about transatlantic relations, that's where the US and European partners can encourage Turkey to move in the right direction and to not fall into the trap of thinking that, tokenism and Potemkin villages, whether it's on sites or inclusion in political parties, et cetera, is really a solution for a structural problem.
Well said, Dr. Prodroma. Thank you very much. I'd like to now turn to Dr. Tinyeri Erdemir.
And I will again be building on where Elizabeth left, and just to remind us all that positive structural change comes very slow and requires arduous, continuous work. To build a democratic, inclusive, pluralistic society is a big challenge. But this is the most important investment that we can do for the future of Turkey and all of its minorities. For that, I would like to, for instance, suggest a point that international support for the cases of individuals like Osman Kavala, who spent his entire life and career for peace building, amends making, and to build a democratic society in Turkey is very important, who have been, punished for all of his work. So international support for those people who put their lives at risk to build a better society is very important, as is international support for projects that have a potential in the long run to contribute to pluralistic and inclusive society.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tanyeri Erdemir. And now I'd like to turn to Dr. Aykan Erdemir.
And again, I would like to begin by thanking the IDC, thanking you, Stephen, for this forward-looking panel. And to end on a positive note, let me share 2 points which make me hopeful for the future. The first one is, at this point in Turkish political history, I think the entire opposition has come to the realization that they have to build an inclusive big tent opposition bloc to defeat Erdogan. So structurally, this is a moment in which finding common ground and working together trumps over an earlier era of majoritarian politics. And a second positive dynamic at work is that although Turkey's pro-Kurdish HDP represents one of the socially and culturally relatively more conservative regions of Turkey, the party itself happens to be at the forefront of pluralist and inclusive politics, and has really taken steps that other parties haven't taken when it comes to minority rights, especially the recognition of Armenian, Greek, and Syriac rights and freedoms and heritage. So that also makes me hopeful. But of course, this has to be a cautious optimism. And I hope Ohannes will excuse me for going into his area of expertise. But while we remain hopeful, we always have to keep in mind the lessons of 1908. That is when, young Turks, and Armenians, joined forces to defeat Abdülhamit II, Erdogan's role model, an Ottoman despot. And when people had a lot of hope for building, pluralism and democracy in the aftermath of autocracy, we know how within only 7 years, that project not only failed, but ended up with some of the worst atrocities the Ottoman Empire has seen over centuries. So while we remain optimistic, we should also be, I think, cautious about the potential pitfalls that can turn projects that start out as positive projects, but which can then recede into yet another episode in the ongoing systematic discrimination and targeting of minorities. So we have reasons to be hopeful, but we also have historical cautionary tales about why we should also be vigilant, and that this is a marathon with lots of ups and downs, and that ultimately this requires an unwavering commitment, a patience commitment to building pluralism, equality, and diversity in Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Erdemir. And I want to extend our organization's thanks to all of you panelists. You all complemented each other really strongly. And I think that hopefully folks who are watching the call, looking for what steps any future Turkish government can take, will have a good framework to base their hopes and expectations off of. For us at IDC, we remain incredibly concerned about the direction in which Erdogan is continuing to take Turkey, and that has ramifications even outside of Turkey's borders, which is something that we've touched on in other events. For the time being, we want to direct everyone to our Take Action page at indefenseofchristians.org. We have a resolution urging Turkey to respect the rights and religious freedoms of the ecumenical patriarchate. That's HR 3056. And we are working with members of Congress to introduce additional legislation to really promote religious freedom in Turkey. So this entire event is viewable online at our YouTube page, on Facebook, on Twitter. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you to Sarah for facilitating the call, and I wish everyone a great day.